The common criticisms directed at the Founding Fathers concerning the formation of the United States and the drafting of the Constitution focus on several perceived defects that entrenched inequality and limited democratic participation. These include the explicit protections afforded to slavery through provisions such as the 3/5 Compromise for representation and taxation, the Fugitive Slave Clause requiring the return of escaped individuals, and the 20-year prohibition on Congress banning the international slave trade. Additional critiques highlight the exclusion of women, Black people, Native Americans, and non-property owners from the full benefits of citizenship under the preambles. We the people, alongside the establishment of undemocratic structures like the Electoral College and equal Senate representation per state. The failure to anticipate political parties and factions, combined with the absence of an initial Bill of Rights, further compounds the list of alleged errors, as does a perceived economic bias favoring elites and inconsistent federalism. Such assessments evaluate the 1787 document against later standards of universal equality and popular sovereignty, portraying the founders as having fallen short of the revolutionary principles they proclaimed. Yet, these criticisms mischaracterize the actual shortcomings of the founding era. The Constitution emerged as a pragmatic compromise to forge a union among sovereign states inheriting a colonial legacy of slavery that no single generation could abolish outright without dissolving the Republic before it began. Provisions related to slavery employed euphemisms to avoid legitimizing the institution in principle and reflected temporary concessions rather than enthusiastic endorsement. Many delegates condemned slavery as immoral or destined for eventual judgment, while personal actions by figures such as Washington, who freed his own slaves in his will, and Franklin, who led an abolition society, demonstrated opposition. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in new territories, signaling a trajectory toward restriction. The deeper deficiency lay not in the handling of slavery itself, but in the absence of explicit mechanisms for exclusion and removal of African populations once their labor proved unutilitarian, whether through repatriation to Africa or relocation elsewhere. Integration without such safeguards invited future conflicts, uprisings, riots, voting blocs, and cultural grievances that stemmed directly from the presence of groups with distinct histories and goals incompatible with seamless assimilation. The broader vision of citizenship and governance similarly required greater foresight into the realities of group differences and the imperative of homogeneity. The narrow initial franchise for white male property owners of European descent aligned with classical Republican thought, emphasizing stakeholding and virtue. Yet, the Constitution stopped short of constitutionalizing permanent racial and national origin barriers. This omission allowed later expansions through amendments to erode the European character of the polity. Structures such as the Electoral College and Senate equality served essential federal balances, protecting small states and regional interests from domination by populous centers. Civic engagement by men of quality remained essential for elevating capable leaders, as exemplified by Washington. The founders underestimated tribalism, the distinct mentalities, values, and conflicting directions of European, African, Native tribal, Mexican, and Jewish groups, assuming their moral example would suffice for all. In failing to embed exclusionary powers, banishment provisions, and limits on suffrage, they left the Republic vulnerable to demographic manipulation, resource competition, and perpetual struggles over power that have defined subsequent American history. The handling of slavery and the imperative of planned removal. The institution of slavery existed as a colonial inheritance long before the Constitutional Convention, and the founders addressed it through pragmatic accommodations rather than creation or celebration. They avoided terms like slave or slavery in the document to prevent any principled endorsement, opting instead for neutral phrasing such as persons held to service or labor. Southern states made clear that ratification hinged on these compromises, rendering outright abolition politically impossible without fracturing the Union. The Three-Fifths Compromise limited rather than maximized Southern power by denying full counting for representation while increasing tax burdens. The Fugitive Clause and trade delay represented finite concessions, with the latter expiring at the earliest constitutional moment when Congress acted to ban the international trade in 1808. Many founders viewed slavery as dishonorable or likely to invite divine retribution, and actions such as the Northwest Ordinance demonstrated intent to contain its spread. These measures reflected the binary choice between imperfect union and no union at all. The true constitutional shortcoming resided in the failure to pair any recognition of slavery with mandatory systems for exclusion and banishment of the African population. Once emancipation occurred or labor became unutilitarian, the absence of provisions for repatriation to Africa or relocation to Mexico ensured permanent integration of groups whose distinct African-derived mentalities, histories, and goals clashed with European norms. The founders recognized racial differences in faculties and temperament, yet assumed moral leadership would overcome them. Without roadmaps for removal, the Republic faced inevitable uprisings, riots, new laws burdensome to the founding stock, voting blocs altering demographics, and ongoing crime patterns that rendered abstract grievances secondary to immediate threats of theft, murder, and factional overthrow. People prioritize personal security over historical narratives when confronted with such realities, rendering later frameworks of equality and civil rights expansions unnecessary burdens that would never have arisen absent the initial failure to exclude. The Constitution thus addressed slavery in precisely the wrong manner by facilitating retention rather than systematic removal. This oversight extended to the broader recognition that a new country required explicit acknowledgement of non-assimilability. Slaves could not simply remain as permanent residents after their utility ended, and the document's silence on exclusion mechanisms allowed demographic permanence. The result has been constant fatigue from cultural and political conflicts traceable directly to this foundational lapse. A republic designed by white European men demanded corresponding exclusivity to preserve liberty, virtue, and homogeneity. By omitting banishment powers tied to abolition or uprisings, the founders ensured that future generations would confront problems absent from societies maintaining stricter separations. The handling of slavery thus reveals not insufficient compromise, but insufficient foresight in planning for removal, rendering integration the root of subsequent national difficulties rather than any initial protection of the institution. The conception of citizenship and the realities of tribalism. Citizenship under the original Constitution rested on a narrow foundation limited to white Europeans of common ancestry, heritage, and beliefs, reflecting the understanding that the polity belonged to these people rather than a universal abstraction. The 1790 Naturalization Act reinforced this by restricting citizenship to free, white persons of good character. Yet the document failed to embed unamendable racial and national origin bars, allowing later amendments to broaden inclusion beyond the founding stock. This expansion ignored the tribal nature of human groups, where Europeans, Africans, native tribes, Mexicans, and Jews each pursued distinct values, histories, and directions incompatible with harmonious blending. The founders assumed their republican virtue and moral example would assimilate all participants, overlooking that races and ethnicities often do not mix without generating major problems of conflict and divergent goals. Tribalism manifested clearly in interactions with non-European groups. Native Americans comprised tribal societies occupying the land prior to European colonization, a neutral historical process of cultural clash in which the stronger prevailed. Reciprocity would have occurred had numbers and weapons favored the tribes. Black populations carried African-derived mentalities that resisted full assimilation despite leadership examples set by the founders. Jewish communities welcomed through Washington's 1790 Newport letter granting full acceptance with assurances of no sanction to bigotry or persecution, established separate systems employing tactics honed in prior host societies on a new canvas. The founders extended carte blanche without grasping that not all tribes shared the same commitment to the European-initiated framework. This underestimation allowed groups to utilize freedoms for their own purposes, advancing conflicting interests that undermined the original experiment. The Constitution's omission of exclusionary mechanisms thus constituted the central flaw in citizenship design. Freedom and liberty were never intended for everybody, but for those historically aligned with the principles of the founding stock. Without built-in powers to maintain homogeneity through banishment or removal, the Republic invited perpetual manipulation of voting, demographics, and resources. Tribal differences in mentality, history, and objectives ensured that inclusion produced uprisings, riots, voting blocks, and cultural grievances rather than unity. A framework explicitly designating the nation as one for white European men by white European men would have prevented these outcomes, balancing liberty with the necessary exclusivity that each group naturally possesses. The founders' vision required this additional element to endure, yet its absence transformed a coherent republic into a site of ongoing demographic and power struggles. Limitations on suffrage and the consequences of expansion. Suffrage in the original design extended primarily to white male property owners of European descent, a deliberate limitation grounded in Republican principles of independence and stakeholding. Women remained properly excluded, their influence channeled through male household heads rather than direct voting. Property qualifications incentivized acquisition and prevented sway by those lacking independent interest in societal stability. Non-property owners, Black people, and Native tribes received no franchise, preserving the polity for the founding demographic. Grown European men formed the core electorate capable of protecting society. Later expansions through the 19th and other amendments introduced women's suffrage, Black voting rights, and broader inclusions that shifted political dynamics in detrimental ways. Women's voting has produced documented patterns of emotional decision-making, support for minority preferences, and opposition to majority male interests in favor of special rights and recognition. This has effectively negated the votes of grown men seeking to safeguard their society, placing America at a strategic disadvantage against nations where women lack suffrage. Teenage and adult women now counterbalance male protective instincts while the country absorbs immigrants from cultures without female voting, creating imbalances in governance. The Constitution should have permanently barred women from the franchise to avoid these distortions. Similarly, Black people and Native tribes should have remained disenfranchised for the reasons tied to their distinct tribal identities and histories of non-assimilation. Non-property owners gained improper leverage without the incentive to acquire stakes, though property itself required clear definition across regions. The failure to constitutionalize these limitations allowed suffrage expansions to erode the European character of the Republic. Grown men of the founding stock required primacy in voting to ensure capable leadership rose through civic engagement. The absence of permanent bars facilitated demographic voting blocks that manipulated power toward equality frameworks, civil rights expansions, and policies burdensome to the original population. A new land designed exclusively by white European men demanded corresponding restrictions to prevent outsiders from gaining leverage through numbers or alliances. Without such exclusions, the system invited constant contention over who controls votes, resources, and direction. The founders erred by not embedding these suffrage limits unalterably, allowing later generations to confront problems of emotional governance, tribal factionalism, and loss of homogeneity that direct male primacy would have forestalled. Governmental structures, factions, and the imperative of enduring exclusivity. The Electoral College and equal Senate representation embodied deliberate federal balances rather than defects. The former prevented direct popular vote manipulation and required broad regional coalitions, while the latter shielded small states from domination by populous centers often filled with recent immigrants and non-Europeans. These mechanisms provided safeguards and checks absent in pure majoritarianism. No perfect election system exists. as history demonstrates, democracies frequently elevate poor leaders through swayed or manipulated ballots. The deeper necessity involved greater male civic duty, with constitutional encouragement or requirements for qualified men to run for office, so that capable individuals, as Washington exemplified, would rise consistently. Conditions of politics deterred many strong candidates, yet broader engagement by European men of quality would have elevated the cream without expanding the electorate. Political parties and factions proved inevitable extensions of human grouping across states, counties, and communities. The Constitution's separation of powers, checks and balances, and later emphasis on speech and press channeled their effects without eliminating them. No law could realistically prevent formation, as factions arise naturally from divergent interests. The founders' warnings against party spirit acknowledged this reality, yet the system accommodated competition while promoting accountability through engaged male participation. An initial Bill of Rights, though helpful for enumerating protections, was ultimately unnecessary in a free society of active men upholding virtue. Rights exist neither as innate grants nor absolute inheritances, but as safeguards maintained by the polity. Their explicit listing invited judicial manipulation and curtailment, transforming protections into potential wrongs when applied selectively. The overarching constitutional deficiency involved the failure to balance liberty, freedom, and virtue with explicit exclusionary powers. The Republic required designation as a country for white European men by white European men, with built-in mechanisms to exclude non-assimilable groups regardless of perceived utility or assimilation. This exclusivity, already implicit in the founding stocks practices, would have preserved homogeneity against demographic shifts, monetary manipulations, and power contests. Later inclusions produced constant struggles over voting rights, resources, and direction that a stricter framework could have avoided. The founders underestimated that not all tribes shared the same goals or histories, allowing freedoms to be abused by groups pursuing separate systems. Their morality and example proved insufficient against these realities, rendering the Constitution incomplete without permanent exclusionary provisions. The result has been a republic defined by ongoing fatigue from tribal conflicts rather than the stable experiment originally envisioned. Conclusion: what the Founding Fathers really got wrong. The Founding Fathers crafted a durable republican framework amid deep divisions, yet their constitutional design contained critical omissions regarding exclusion and tribal awareness. Common critiques emphasizing insufficient democracy and excessive inequality invert the actual shortcomings by lamenting prudent limitations rather than the absence of mechanisms to maintain the polity's European character. Slavery received temporary pragmatic handling, but without paired removal provisions for African populations, integration generated enduring conflicts. Citizenship remained initially narrow yet lacked unamendable racial bars, permitting expansions that eroded homogeneity. Suffrage restrictions for women, non-property owners, black people, and native tribes aligned with stability but received no permanent constitutionalization, inviting detrimental shifts through emotional voting and demographic blocks. Governmental structures such as the Electoral College and Senate equality provided essential federal safeguards, while factions and rights required male civic engagement rather than elaborate enumeration. The core error resided in underestimating tribalism among distinct groups: Europeans, Africans, native tribes, Mexicans, and Jews, each advancing separate mentalities, values, and objectives. The founders assumed virtue would suffice for assimilation, overlooking that races and ethnicities generate problems when mixed without exclusionary powers. A new country demanded explicit designation for white European men, with banishment and removal systems to address non-utilitarian presence or uprisings. This exclusivity would have prevented voting manipulations, resource competitions, and cultural grievances that have defined subsequent history. The Constitution's adaptability through amendment allowed later corrections, yet the failure to embed foundational exclusivity from the outset left the Republic vulnerable to perpetual contention. By not balancing liberty with homogeneity, the founders ensured that freedom remained contested rather than secured for the founding stock. The experiment's success hinged on recognizing that not all groups share the same commitments or directions, requiring built-in limits to preserve the original vision. These omissions, rather than the compromises criticized in standard accounts, represent the true constitutional shortcomings that continue to shape American challenges.